Okay, welcome once again, guys. This is our third lecture on Ben Jonson's play, Every Man Out of His Humor. As I was saying on Canvas Mail, I anticipate there being one more lecture after this, I'm afraid, because there's just, as you know, an awful lot to get through in this very, very strange and challenging text that we've had before us for the last 2 weeks. Ben Jonson's play of 1599 and 1600. I'm coming to you today from my richly decorated office, still observing social distancing, but there's too many people in my house for me to be able to record these lectures, so I came up to the office for this one today. And my kids complained. My kids found the videos on YouTube and they complained that I didn't talk about them, and I'm like, well, guys, the class isn't about you. But anyway, there's some pictures of them. So now I've talked about them. Okay. Last time we took a preliminary look at the nature of Ben Jonson's comedy, mostly through those two scenes with the miserly farmer Sordido. And I introduced a phrase, comic distancing, as a let's say a trendy, like for this moment, trendy phrase that we can use to talk about the nature of Ben Jonson's comedy. It's a comedy in which we as audience members are not, I think, meant to be drawn in or sucked in organically or emotionally, as will tend to happen to us when we're watching a Shakespearean new comedy. Rather, it's a comedy where we're almost pushed out of the action, pushed out away from the play, behind those multiple and nested frames through which Jonson is operating, which I'm not going to talk about today. That framing issue is the one that I want to talk about in the last lecture tomorrow or the next day. I hope to get that out. So comic distancing, we are alienated as an audience from what is happening on the stage. And what I want to talk about today is some of the ways in which Jonson seems to try to achieve that effect, and in greater detail maybe what it's like. But it's then a comedy where we are very much not laughing with the people on the stage in any way. We are laughing at them on this distanced or alienated model. That is consistent with the ancient model that Jonson is using, the model of so-called old comedy, which I talked about in a previous lecture, that kind of comedy going back to classical Athens, the comedy of Aristophanes and so on. It's also, and I think this is really worth recognizing, it's a kind of comedy which has never gone away and is very much still with us. And maybe if this were a different course, we would be able to do some broader thinking about what this kind of comedy tells us about the overall phenomenon of comedy. But a comedy of alienation, of laughing at rather than laughing with, that's the kind of comedy you find in classic slapstick, the Marx Brothers or whatever. That's the comedy of the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner coyote stuff, right? When the coyote has that anvil fall on his head, you're laughing at him rather than with him. The comedy of Tom and Jerry, and perhaps a more contemporary work point would be the kind of comedy that has been not pioneered but explored and developed in the last 10 or 20 years by Ricky Gervais, that the Office type humor, of which there are now multiple variations running around in our culture, as you guys will know much better than I do. When you're watching that kind of comedy, you very much don't want to be there. It's painful to watch in many ways, and yet you can't look away from it. That, I think, is the kind of effect that Jonson is going for reasons and through techniques that I want to talk about a little bit today. And I want to do that by pursuing this idea of comic distancing, which again we only looked at last time through really two scenes, the Sordido scenes, which we extracted from the main action because they lend themselves to that. But I want to pursue this topic through the main narrative line of the play, insofar as we ever have a really main narrative line in Every Man Out of His Humor. As I was saying last time, this is not the kind of play which, for the most part, is driven by a continuous or organic line of plot. It's much more like a loose circulation of comic scenes. Nonetheless, insofar as there is a main line that we can discern, that's what I want to try to work down today, and we'll begin accordingly in Act 2, Scene 1, a very long and complex scene in a play almost entirely composed of very long and complex scenes. And we could begin just by noting whom we're looking at in this scene, Act 2, Scene 1. We're first of all looking at the courtier Fastidious Brisk. Oh, please be reminded that I did put that summary, that narrative summary of what the heck actually happens in this play on the Canvas page, and I hope that's useful for you guys. But again, so Act 2, Scene 1, we're looking at the vain, handsome courtier Fastidious Brisk, and Sogliardo, that's the other rich farmer, the one who is obsessed with the idea of becoming a gentleman. And Carlo Buffone. He's one of the wit characters in the play. Carlo being the scurrilous, lascivious, drunk one. So Brisk, Sogliardo, and Carlo in Act 2, Scene 1. They are later joined by Sordido, remember that's the miserly farmer, and Fungoso, Sordido's son. And they all come together at the country house of the knight, whose name is Puntarvolo. For no particular reason do they come together at this country house. It's just an idea that Jonson has had for a bit, a scene. The scene does at least one very important bit of narrative business, plot line business for Every Man Out of His Humor. The scene, Act 2, Scene 1, introduces the knight's plan to travel to Constantinople and back. And this is a plan that comes up repeatedly over the course of the play as it is revised and moved toward execution in various ways. So this travel plan of the knight of Puntarvolo, as I'm saying, it furnishes the play with almost the closest thing it has to an ongoing narrative scheme. The other episodes just kind of hang off this main line of Puntarvolo's travel plans. And so I want to start with that. Just before we get into the scene, I want to introduce and get clear about a couple of terms which come up again and again in the play itself, or the way we have to talk about the play, and terms which accordingly we can take as technical terms for our purposes. First of all, the word humorist I want to talk about, because it has the potential to be very confusing. Humorist and also the adjective humorous. Both of them obviously deriving from the central term of this play, which is the term humor. And we've discussed this many times, but it is worth reviewing. A humor, in the first place, it's a medical conception, a conception for a substance or stuff which is rolling around in your body and in everybody's bodies. And there are various versions of humoral theory in the medieval and Renaissance period. On the main one, there's 4 of these humors: melancholy, choler, phlegm, and blood. And keeping them in balance is very important for maintaining physical health. While if the humors get out of balance, if you get too much of one or too much of the other, you have both potentially physical and psychological problems. The classic example in the period, of course, being the melancholy humor, which is thought of again as a stuff that is in your body, much the way as we today think of blood and lymph. We've got stuff in the Renaissance body, a liquid called melancholy, and if you get too much of it in you, which can occur through poorly managed diet and various things like that, if you get too much melancholy in you, then you suffer from melancholy, what we now call depression. That's the idea of humors in the first instance. By this period, by the early 17th century, the word humor is coming to be used and deployed very loosely and very metaphorically. And that's how it's being used by the people in Jonson's play. What is a humor then in Jonson's play? Just to make this rather difficult point once again, because it's very important. A humor is a mood. A humor is a passion. A humor is an obsession. People in Jonson's play who are in the grip of a humor are called humorists. And we just want to be clear about that in order to avoid confusion, because, of course, when we say humorist, we mean today, we mean a comedian, right? A funny person. That's not what it means in Jonson's play. A humorist means somebody who is in the grip of a humor, okay? And humorous, the adjective, means relating to humors or relating to such a humorist, such an obsession. Excuse me, such an obsessive person, somebody in the grip of an obsession or humor. The other terms that I want to introduce, which are new to our discussion of this play, but help us, I think, to begin to sort it rather readily and easily, are first of all the term gull, G-U-L-L, gull, and second of all the term gallant, G-A-L-L-A-N-T. Let's start with that one. What's a gallant? It's a word for a kind of person in early modern London. A gallant is a cool guy or cool lady, but mostly cool guy. A big man about town, a hipster, a player, whatever. A gallant is the kind of person that you want to be, with style, with wit, with friends, with hangers-on, and so on. A gull is the opposite of a gallant. A gull is a fool, a rube, an idiot, somebody who gets taken in, who gets made fun of, who gets joked about. So, we're looking at an opposition, a play, let's say, in Jonson's play, between who makes a joke and who gets joked about, right? Who is made fun of and who does the making fun? Who's in on the joke and who's just a joke? Gallants are the ones who are making the fun, making jokes, in on the joke, laughing at others. Gulls are the ones who are getting laughed at, getting made fun of. They are not in on the joke, rather they are a joke. The basic dynamic, let's say, of all the scenes in Every Man Out of His Humor, and the basic dynamic, accordingly, of Jonson's version of old comedy. The basic dynamic is one in which gallants make fun of gulls. And that's what happens in varying scenarios and in various ways over and over again over the course of this play. That's the comic business. That's what circulates from scene to scene, from location to location of early modern London in Jonson's comedic vision. And again, in another kind of course where we were perhaps thinking more systematically about the nature of comedy, we'd probably be able to, because we all enjoy various kinds of comedy, we'd be able to recognize and probably pin down lots of comedic acts that we like, where we're going to be able to say it's basically the same business, the same kind of joke over and over again, simply varying the scenario, the cast of characters, and so on. But we don't want to get caught up in that because we have too much work to do as it is. So again, just getting clear, that's a kind of sketch of how Jonson's comedy is working in this play. Gallants making fun of gulls over and over and over again. So Act 2, Scene 1, as I've said, is where I want to begin looking at the play under these headings that we've now laid out for today. And I want to begin specifically at Act 2, Scene 1, let's say from line 37. This is going to be on page 162 in our course book. Okay, remember, we have Fastidius, the courtier, Carlo, the wit, and also Sogliardo, the rich, stupid farmer who wants to become a gentleman. We pick this up at line 37 with Fastidius asking Carlo a question about he calls it his hobby, which regrettably is a word that has the potential to confuse us a lot. So let's gloss that quickly. When Fastidius talks about his hobby, he's actually referring to a certain kind of small horse, okay? And we have a footnote on that. So it's horse talk, which is the kind of thing that people like to do in early modern London, where horses are very important. Sogliardo is going to pick up on that word hobby later in this exchange, and he's going to think that Fastidius means a hobby horse, which is a wooden, a pretend horse that you ride on, and is also something that is used in the traditional English folk entertainment known as Morris dancing. And a joke gets made about that. But for the moment, we have Fastidius asking Carlo a question about his horse, Fastidius's horse, that is. And no doubt we're already confused. Let's see what we can make come out of this. Fastidius at line 37 says, Sirrah Carlo, thou never sawest my grey hobby yet, didst thou? Carlo says, no, have you such a one? Fastidius says, the best in Europe, my good villain, thou'lt say, when thou seest him. Carlo, but when shall I see him? Fastidius, there was a nobleman in the court offered me £100 for him by this light, a fine little fiery slave. He runs like excellent, excellent, with the very sound of the spur. How, says Carlo, the sound of the spur? Fastidius says, it's the only humour now extant, sir. A good jingle, and I'll pause there. There's a long footnote on this point about Fastidius's jingle, about his spurs. We nowadays, of course, most of us have very little to do with horses, so we don't think this way anymore or think about this kind of thing anymore. In early modern Europe, of course, horses are absolutely essential, and so and accordingly, so are the various pieces of horse riding clothing and accoutrement, including spurs, those spiky things that you wear in your boots to dig into the horse's sides and make him run faster. Fastidius, it turns out, is talking about a certain fashion which existed in early modern London at this time, in 1599, 1600, for spurs that were so incredibly big and loud that they were almost useless for actually jabbing the horse, but they made a wonderful sound. There's bells on these spurs, so they go jingle, 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 just like you're wearing bear bells on your feet. Fastidius is insisting that his horse runs just when he hears the sound of the spur, rather than being jabbed by them, and he is, with great satisfaction, telling Carlo, look, that's what it's all about these days. A good jingle. You got to have these cool spurs that jingle a lot, and if you do have them, then you're quite the man. Carlo says to Sogliardo, in the manner of an aside, he says to Sogliardo, splud, which, as you may or may not know, is a very, very common early modern expletive. Splud, it's a shortened form of his blood, Christ's blood, splud, and there are other variants on this kind of expletive, or slight and slid. All we need to know really is that that's a swear word. It's like saying fucking hell, splud. Carlo says to Sogliardo, splud, you shall see him turn Morris dancer. He has got him bells, a good suit, and a hobby horse. And I'm going to pause there. Just that little section of Act 2, Scene 1, from line 37 down to line 52. And the point I want to make about it is this. For the most part, in this section of Jonson's play, this part of Act 2, Scene 1, in fact, for the most part, as you will see if you read through it, in some cases with the help of the footnotes, because of course the period detail is very rich and very hard for us to make our way through. For the most part, in Act 2, Scene 1, it's very clear that the gull is Sogliardo, the rich farmer who wants to become a gentleman, who doesn't understand anything about what being a gentleman is, and accordingly Carlo is laying him down with a lot of bullshit, which is partly at his expense and partly at the expense of gentlemanly behavior, about how you should behave to your wife and at the theater and in the restaurant and so on. But for the most part, Sogliardo is the gull. Carlo is a gallant, and Fastidius is a gallant, for the most part in this scene. And yet, in this little exchange that we've just read, another joke comes to the fore, this joke about Fastidius and fashion, his spurs that jingle. Another joke comes to the fore, and so for that moment, Sogliardo is actually drawn into the joke by Carlo. Fastidius is talking about his horse, talking about spurs. We come to that ridiculous line, a good jingle. And Carlo turns to Sogliardo and says to Sogliardo, oh my gosh, this guy's unbelievable, referring to Fastidius Brisk. So I hope the point that I'm making is at least slightly clear. We have this clear, I hope, we have this division, let's just put it that way, in Early Man, every man out of his humor, between gulls and gallants. The whole comedy depends on that distinction between gulls and gallants. Sogliardo clearly is a gull for the most part, and for the most part even in this scene. And yet for this moment, because the joke shifts to being about Fastidius, Sogliardo is drawn into the joke with Carlo like a gallant. For the moment, he is not the gull. For the moment, Sogliardo, is in on the joke rather than being made the joke. Which is to say that the joke at any one moment in his comic action, and whatever the joke is at any one moment in his comic action, the joke is what Jonson cares about, and really pretty much all he cares about. He is disinterested, for the most part, as we have already discussed, in plot, in continuous complex lines of narrative. He's, for the most part, totally disinterested in anything that we could call characterization. The characters of Every Man Out are stock characters, stock types, as we have discussed. They are two-dimensional characters, but sometimes they are barely even that. When these characters appear in the grip of their humor, when Sordido is being miserly, or Sogliardo is social climbing, or Fastidius is being vain, when they appear in the grip of their humor, they are recognizable as the types that they are. But they don't always appear in the grip of their humor. Sometimes they're just kind of there to kind of fill in the scene, or be the straight man, or be a member of a large multilateral dialogue at the expense of somebody else. What Jonson is interested in, rather, is this succession of scenes, this succession of making fun of, pointing at bits of comic action. Now, Puntarvolo in Act 2, Scene Home arrives. Puntarvolo at Act 2, Scene 1 arrives home. And this is going to be on page 171 in our course books. And he is observed, unseen by the others. So we have Carlo, Sogliardo, and Fastidius outside Puntarvolo's house, waiting for him, bantering, chatting. Puntarvolo arrives. Now the others are watching him. Watching him while he doesn't realize that they are watching him. So we again have that framing effect of Jonson's comedy coming to the fore. They're watching Puntarvolo. Cordatus and Mittis, the chorus, are watching them watching him. We, the audience, are watching the chorus, watching them watching him. And at the focal point of all these frames, at the focal point of this nested system of comic observation and alienation, we have always in Jonson's play, we had a humorist, somebody in the grip of a humor, a mood, an obsession, a fantasy. In this case, Act 2, Scene 1, the humorist is Puntarvolo, the knight, and his humor, his obsession, at this point at least, is romance. Romance that is in the period literary sense that we learned about a couple of weeks ago when we spent some time with Shakespeare's Fairy Queen. Excuse me. Puntarvolo evidently likes to pretend that he is a knight errant in a romance tale. It's there are shades of Don Quixote, Cervantes' Don Quixote, which would be published about 5 years after Jonson's play. And so this scene is consistent with what I said a couple of weeks ago about romance, literary romance, these tales of knights and ladies being for the most part treated or viewed as old-fashioned and ridiculous in the High Renaissance period. It's completely unlike Spenser's extended attempt, as we saw in The Faerie Queene, to take romance seriously. Puntarvolo has the humor of romance. He's obsessed with it, and he is fantasizing when he comes to his own house that he is arriving at a strange castle, like a knight errant, requesting food and lodging from the beautiful lady who lives there. And there are erotic overtones with modern analogs or versions here. The long married couple in which the husband comes home pretending to be, the UPS delivery guy or whatever, and various kinds of things ensue. Puntarvolo, obsessed with romance, in this scene is the humorist. He's the one expressing a humor, and that also puts him in the position of the gull in this portion of this scene. The one who is being watched, the one who is being made fun of, the one who is being joked about from the surrounding frame by a crowd of watching gallants. And yet over the course of this scene, which I'm just going to summarize because it's very long, something very odd and I hope interesting happens. Puntarvolo has a long exchange calling up to his own house. He has a long exchange, first of all, with a waiting woman who comes to the window, and then finally with his wife who comes to the window, and he goes into a lot of kind of flowery, fake Petrarchan poetry about how beautiful she is and how she put the sun to shame and all that kind of stuff. And then I want to watch what happens, please, at, let's say, line 305. We'll pick it up from line 311. So I'm now, and this is a little bit confusing, I'm now in Act 2, Scene 1, line 311. That's on page 178 in our course books. Puntarvolo has just declaimed a kind of fake Petrarchan poem to his wife. Fastidius, observing and commenting, Fastidius says, "How, in verse?" Carlo says, an ecstasy, man." The lady says, "Is your desire to speak with me, Sir Knight?" That's Puntarvolo's wife. Carlo, "He will tell you that anon. Neither his brain nor his body are yet molded for an answer." And unfortunately, our text makes this a little bit unclear at exactly this moment of Act 2, Scene 1. But neither Puntarvolo nor his wife are aware of or hearing the contributions from the gallants who are watching them. Okay, that's all in the nature of an aside. Puntarvolo says, "Most debonair and luculent lady, I decline me as low as the basis of your altitude." In other words, I'm bowing as low to the ground as you are high above it. The scene goes on accordingly, and skipping ahead a little bit, the lady, Puntarvolo's wife, finally comes down, and I'm now looking at line 364. There's a stage direction. "Enter the lady with her gentleman." The lady sees all these guys watching for the first time, and she says, "God's me, here's company, turn in again." And she goes back into the house. Fastidius says, "Slight, darn it, slight, our presence has cut off the convoy of the jest." Carlo says, "All the better, I'm glad on't, for the issue is very perspicuous. Come, let's discover and salute the knight." In other words, come on, let's show ourselves. Let's step out of hiding and say hi, which they do. Puntarvolo says, "Stay, who be these that address themselves towards us?" "What, Carlo? Now by the sincerity of my soul, welcome, welcome, gentlemen. And how dost thou, grand scourge?" Or second, untruss of the world. So they meet and greet Puntarvolo and the others, and then skipping down to line 394. Sordido has joined them. Sogliardo is offering to introduce him to the others. Sordido is being a bit of a jerk about it. And then all the way down at line 404, we have Fungoso, the law student, staring at Fastidius, and he says to himself, "By Jesus, it's a very fine suit of clothes." What is happening here in this section of Act 2, Scene 1? Well, I want to point out what isn't happening first. What isn't happening is any kind of comic or narrative continuity or payoff from the Puntarvolo knight-errant part of the scene. We have this whole bit, this whole gag of Puntarvolo as an obsessed person thinking he's a knight in a romance, courting his own wife and all that stuff. That's worked up very carefully and very richly by Jonson. That gag then kind of comes to an end when his wife comes down and sees everybody watching. But Puntarvolo does not react at being watched. He doesn't say, "What the heck are you guys doing here, you jerks?" He doesn't ride at them like a knight errant carrying through with his humor. Jonson just basically drops that idea. It's as if, that was a little comic lemon that he wanted to get some juice out of. He got all the juice out of it he could get. He throws it away. Rather than there being any narrative or comic continuity, we just drop it and we go on to the next idea that Jonson has, which is the idea that we ended on there at line 404, the idea of Fungoso's obsession with fashion. So if we think about how the comedic content of this part of the play is being brought together, it's like Jonson has one idea over here, that's the Puntarvolo knight-errant idea. He has another idea over here, that's the Fungoso obsessed with fashion idea. He needs some way of getting us from that idea to that idea, and he basically just does it any old way at all, with the kind of lamest, most contrived segue you can imagine. But again, that kind of plot continuity is not anything that Jonson is interested in. What he is interested in is just his bits, his gags. The scene has been played, the fun has been made, Jonson moves on. Even the idea of Puntarvolo as a knight-errant, although Jonson seems to think that's pretty funny, and he puts a lot of effort into that bit between Puntarvolo and his wife. When that has run its course, Jonson simply drops it. Or perhaps he converts it into the Constantinople travel plan idea. Again, the construction of the play, the connecting strands between the various comic scenes are very loose and very weak frequently in Jonson's play. It's the comic scenes themselves that are often very complex, very rich, very carefully worked out. That's what Jonson cares about. He doesn't really care that much about how we get from the one to the other. Now, as I've said several times, that the main business of this scene, Act 2, Scene 1, is that it introduces Puntarvolo's plan to travel to Constantinople and back. And I want to map this out a bit, both because I think it is genuinely quite funny, and because it, as I've said, is the closest thing we have to an ongoing line of plot in Every Man Out, and for another reason that will develop as we go through our look at the scene. Okay, so we first learn about this plan at Act 2, Scene 1, line 525, I think it will be. Yes, this is on page 191 in our course books. Act 2, Scene 1, line 525. Puntarvolo lays out his plan to Carlo. He says, "I do intend this year of Jubilee to travel, and because I will not altogether go upon expense, I am determined to put forth some £5,000 to be paid me 5 for 1 upon the return of myself, my wife and my dog, from the Turk's court in Constantinople. If all or either of us miscarry in the journey, 'tis gone. If we be successful, why, there will be 25,000 pound to entertain time withal. And a little bit later in this scene, line 537, Carlo looks at the dog, says, "Is this the dog goes with you?" Puntarvolo, "This is the dog, sir." Carlo, "He do not go barefoot, does he?" Puntarvolo says, "Away, you traitor, away." In other words, you're so witty, Carlo, making a joke about my dog being in bare feet. He's a dog! Carlo says, "Nay, afore God I speak simply. He may prick his foot with a thorn and be as much as the whole venture is worth. Besides, for a dog that never traveled before, it's a huge journey to Constantinople. I'll tell you now, an he were mine, I'd have some present conference with the physician, what antidotes were good to give him, and preservatives against poison, for assure you, if once your money be out, there'll be divers attempts made against the life of the poor animal." So Puntarvolo has this crazy and patently ridiculous scheme to travel from London to Constantinople, Istanbul, and back, accompanied by himself, his wife, and his dog. They are going to make this journey, and he's going to finance it by basically selling futures in himself. He is going to invest £5,000 in his own journey on a ratio or a wager of 5 to 1. So he's making contracts, agreements with various people, according to which he's giving them £5,000 in total. They agree to pay him back 5 to 1 if he comes back safely from Constantinople with his wife and his dog. So it's a ridiculous kind of get-rich-quick scheme, which Jonson is satirizing. And I would ask you please to note the role and the importance of the dog in the scheme. As in Carlo's joke about, well, is your dog going to go barefoot to Constantinople? We'll do, he's a dog. That wonderful line, well, for a dog that has never traveled before, it might be difficult, not like all those well-traveled dogs that we know about. We come back to the Constantinople scheme in Act 3, Scene 1, and I would ask you guys to turn to it. It's going to be Act 3, Scene 1, from line 56 down to about line 80. Act 3, Scene 1, again, a very long, very complex scene set in an extremely important and well-known early modern London location known as Paul's Walk. That means it's inside St. Paul's Cathedral, which is not the St. Paul's Cathedral that you see today if you visit London. That one was built in the late 17th century, or beginning in the late 17th century after the Great Fire of London in 1666. But this is the previous cathedral building which stood on that site. It was a huge Gothic cathedral. What's important about that for our purposes is not the nature of the architecture, but rather that St. Paul's Cathedral in late 16th century London was really the kind of social and economic center of the whole city. It was a place where people went not so much to go to church, that wasn't almost the function of the building in that period, as much as to walk around, to see and be seen, and to transact business. And as we'll see in a later part of our discussion today, it's also a place where people would actually put up advertisements for services that they were able to offer. So the social and economic center, the hub of early modern London, Paul's Walk, the interior of the great building, St. Paul's Cathedral. And in Act 3, Scene 1, almost everybody comes into St. Paul's Cathedral and wanders around for a while, circulates in that characteristic Johnsonian motion. And Puntarvolo comes on at line 56 with Carlo, 2 serving men following, one leading the dog, okay, and the other holding a cat in a bag. Puntarvolo says to the serving man, "Sir, take my cloak." And then to the one with the dog, he says, "And you, sir knave, follow me closer. If thou losest my dog, thou shalt die a dog's death. I will hang thee." Um, and Carlo makes a couple of jokes about the serving man. And then Carlo was asking Puntarvolo, hey, how's it going with your Constantinople plan? Are you almost ready to go? Puntarvolo says, and I'm now looking at line 67, I guess it is, top of page 220. Puntarvolo says, no, I do want yet, in other words, I'm lacking. No, I do want yet some 15 or 1600 pounds, but my lady, my wife, is out of her humor. She does not now go. My wife is not going to accompany me anymore on the Constantinople trip. My wife is out of her humor. She does not now go. Carlo, no? How then? Puntarvolo says, Mary, I am now enforced to give it out upon the return of myself, my dog, and my cat. Carlo, your cat? Where is she? Puntarvolo, my squire has her there in the bag. Sirrah, look to her. Take care of my cat. We are evidently supposed to think that Puntarvolo and his servants are leading an actual dog along behind them. We are evidently supposed to think there is an actual living dog on the stage, but not an actual cat wandering around, but there is a cat in a bag on the stage. That evidently is what we are supposed to think. And I want to come back to that. For now, I just want to conclude mapping Puntarvolo's travel plan, which we next hear about at Act 4, Scene 3. A long scene between Puntarvolo and a notary, that is to say, a legal officer who is taking down the details of this plan Puntarvolo has in order to be able to draw up the contract that he's making with the various people who are going to invest in his journey, or we're going to take his wager, his 5-to-1 wager. We have Puntarvolo with the notary, the dog and cat as before, and I'll just read a tiny bit of this. Puntarvolo says at line 6, well then, first, the sum is to be understood. Notary says, good, sir. Puntarvolo, next, our several appellations, names, in other words, our several appellations and character of my dog and cat must be known. And he says to one of his servants, show him the cat, sir. So it seems at that point the cat at least gets taken out of its bag and then put back into the bag. And that more or less maps the Puntarvolo Constantinople travel plan. Even though the plan takes us almost to the end of the play, Act 5, Scene 1, when Puntarvolo visits court with the others just before leaving. But we've mapped that continuing idea well enough, I think, the idea of Puntarvolo's plan to travel to Constantinople and back. And I just want to make explicit something very wonderful, actually, and I think genuinely funny has happened in the course of my attempt to make sense of this narrative point for you guys. Namely, the narrative account I've been trying to give has actually been hijacked by a totally different element of Jonson's comedy in these scenes, and that is precisely the presence of a dog and a cat on stage, especially the dog, who becomes a very important personage in scene after scene of Every Man Out of His Humor. In Act 3, Scene 1, the character Shift, whom we haven't come to yet, in Act 3, Scene 1, the character Shift, a professional smoker, as I described him in the summary, is actually offering to teach the dog to smoke, to bring the dog to the whiff, as Jonson puts it. Smoking being a very new, very trendy activity in late 16th century Europe. And finally, in Act 5, Scene 1, at court, the dog actually gets murdered by the satirist Macalente. And that leads to the catastrophe of the play. The dog becomes a veritable obsession. He's present in at least 4 long scenes. He is crucial to Puntarvolo's Constantinople travel scheme. which, as we said, is the nearest thing this play has to a continuous idea of plot. And again, it seems like we have to think there's a real dog on stage, because how else would they possibly do it? If there were a dog puppet getting dragged along, that would just be completely ridiculous and deflationary. If it were an actor in a dog suit, that would be such a distraction. There would have to be jokes and allusions and references to that. We don't find anything like that. So we're left, evidently, with the notion that Jonson has written a comedy in which he's given a very important part to a dog. Now, what do we do with that? I think we can do quite a bit with it and make two main points or groups of points, one of which is going to be rather simple and very funny, potentially, in the play. The other, much more complex, much more tantalizing, much more difficult to unpack. But to deal with the simple part first, or the simple idea first, it is an adage in the theater and in the movies and in television: do not work with children or animals, right? Do not work with children or animals, especially animals, because, of course, they are completely uncontrollable. You cannot reason with a dog. A child you can bribe, which will cause immense problems for that child in later life, but at least you'll get the product in the can, right? You can't promise a dog that if he says his lines right or whatever, that you'll give him a case of pop later. You can train a dog or other animal, of course, and in our contemporary television and film industry, as you guys know, there's a whole sub-industry of people whose job it is to train and wrangle various kinds of animals to do various kinds of things in the TV or movies. But for that kind of thing, you're working with an animal just to get a shot lasting maybe 5 or 10 seconds, right? You need the dog to come in through the dog door, steal the cat's lunch, and run back out the dog door, something like that. Here in the theater, we're talking about Jonson having a dog on stage for long, long scenes that run on perhaps for 10 or 20 minutes at a time. And elsewhere in the early modern drama, we will sometimes, rarely, but sometimes find animals on stage, but they're usually just kind of transiting across the stage. So Shakespeare has a famous stage direction in his play A Winter's Tale, where a character runs off and the stage direction is exit, pursued by a bear. So you've got either a bear, could be a real bear, or it could be an actor in a bear suit, rawr, running after this actor as he exits. But it's momentary, right? You can get an animal, if it's a real animal, to do something momentary. You can have a dog run across the stage. But to have a dog on the stage, as it were a crucial member of the dramatis personae, crucial to the plot, that's really quite incredible. And one way to think about the presence of the dog and, oh my gosh, the cat in Jonson's Every Man Out of His Humor is just that it is a recipe or device for total comic chaos. As though lurking between the lines of this play is a whole other unwritten, unscripted theatrical experience of ad-lib action around the dog. So you're on stage with a dog. What do you do if the dog starts to wander off or whine, or the dog sees another dog in the audience and starts to bark at it, or the dog cocks its leg and pees, or the dog takes a crap on the stage? I mean, the potential for chaos around this dog is just absolutely unbelievable. It is potentially very funny, but at the risk of derailing the play completely. And that's before we even get to the cat. I mean, can you imagine? Jonson is asking us to have the idea that at one point in this play, Puntarvolo's servants come on stage with a cat in a bag. Have you ever put or carried a cat in a bag? That's chaos, right? And then in Act 4, Scene 3, the cat is evidently supposed to be lifted out of the bag and then put back into the bag. I mean, if you have ever had any encounter with cats, the mind boggles. Now, it's possible that with the cat, we could be dealing just with a cat puppet because we see it only once, very briefly, and then the cat it doesn't come onto the stage anymore. But the larger point really is around the presence of the dog. That we have to deal with. That's really in our faces in this idea that Jonson has had. And again, at the very least, the dog is a recipe for sheer comic disorder. And that brings us then to the more complex point that I want to try to make about this before we wrap up this rather long lecture. And the complex version of the point still jumps off from the recognition that having a dog on stage is really problematic. That's really tricky. Why, in the last analysis, is it tricky to have a dog on stage? Well, really, I think it's quite simple. It's because the dog does not know that it is in a play, right? A dog is a being which simply has no conception of the distinction between art and reality. Now, this is very, very tantalizing stuff and very difficult to unpack satisfactorily. And there's probably more than one way to unpack the presence of the dog in Jonson's play under this sort of higher setting that we're trying to operate at here right now. A setting which is consistent with that theoretical level that I've tried to gesture toward or invoke at various times over the last 11 weeks in our course. So if we try to think this through, the dog has no conception of the relationship between art and reality. Art itself, in the largest sense, depends on its distinction from reality. And that means it depends, in turn, on the very category of reality, what the world is supposed to be, rather than what the world is supposed to be not. Art is precisely the not world, right? Which we project as a reflection or representation of the world, and at least according to a traditional way of thinking about this, we do this precisely in hopes of being able to see the world itself better. Art, the not world, reflects the world and allows us to see the world more clearly or with deeper insight. So we're operating, thanks to Jonson's dog, and I hope this is a moment where we perhaps feel that we can make friends with Ben Jonson a little bit. We're operating with the help of Jonson and his dog on very profound and difficult and ancient philosophical territory. That's the territory of mimesis, the imitation and or representation of reality in art. Ultimately, this is Platonic territory, as some of you will know, taking us all the way back to the extended discussion of mimesis that we get in Plato's Republic, Book 10. The concept or phenomenon of mimesis, the representation or imitation of reality, it's always raised implicitly or explicitly in the Playhouse. Jonson is raising it or highlighting it via this dog. The dog can't have an encounter with art, either from outside the art or inside the art. The dog can enter the Playhouse like an audience member, but it has no idea that is what it is doing or that it is what it is becoming. The dog can be on stage like a performer, but it has no idea that is what it is doing or that is how it's being seen. The dog, this dog in Jonson's play, is on the stage, but it is not acting, right? It's in the play, yet not in the play, because the dog, can have no idea of being in a play. So, very, very tricky stuff, as I've said. But I want to connect it, and this will be the last point that I'll make this afternoon in the next 5 or 10 minutes, then we'll wrap up. I want to connect this rather highfalutin discussion of mimesis around Jonson's dog to this topic of what I've been calling comic distancing in Jonson's play. I want to connect it to a remarkable effect of alienation or distancing that Jonson is able to produce between his characters and the audience, us. Now, to a large extent, this effect is lost on us members of English 310 in 2020, because we're not where and when the play is directed toward. It's part of this play, part of the artifact that Every Man Out is, that it takes place in London, and it's set in London. It is set and being watched in the same location by people who themselves are set in that location. Londoners, members of the early modern London milieu that Jonson is satirizing on stage. And of course, early modern London, even though they think of it as a big city, it's pretty compact, actually. Nothing is all that far from anything else in the city as it existed at that time. So Jonson's audience, watching Jonson's play, is not being treated to scenes that are in any way exotic or bewildering. Quite the contrary. They are being treated to scenes that are exceedingly familiar to them. Just as if the play is a kind of magic window that is allowing them to peer through and just look at various aspects of their own city, the place that is so extremely familiar to them. They're watching the world go by in watching Every Man Out of His Humor, the local world, their world, the world that they know very well. Act 3, Scene 1, if we could turn to that at the beginning, and this is not a new point, but continuing and trying to explain the point that I was just trying to make. Act 3, Scene 1, we're introduced to the character Shift, who is a kind of petty criminal, unemployed, partly prostitute, partly pimp, partly thief, partly poser character, as well as having this skill in smoking that I've talked about a couple of times. We begin Act 3, Scene 1 with Cavalier Shift. He calls himself Cavalier Shift because he claims to be a returned soldier. Cavalier Shift enters, as the stage direction says, with 2 sequices in his hand. Basically, a sequis is basically a poster or a bill that Shift is going to put up. And I'm going to read this. We begin the scene with the chorus, Cordatus and Mitis. Shift comes in with these posters in his hand. Cordatus says, "Oh, Mary, this is one for whose better illustration we must desire you to presuppose the stage, the middle aisle in Paul's." So we're in Paul's Walk. "And that," pointing to the door on which Shift is posting his bills, "the west end of it." Mitis, "So, sir, and what follows?" Cordatus, faith, a whole volume of humor and worthy the unclasping." And then I'll skip down to line 21. Shift is putting up his posters on the door. And he says, "This is rare. I have set up my bills without discovery, without being noticed." He's looking around the stage of the globe. So he's putting up his posters, looking around the empty stage of the Globe Theatre, and he's saying, "Wow, this is great. I was able to put up my posters and nobody saw me. Weird. You know, usually there's lots of people here in St. Paul's." It is as though, here in Act 3, Scene 1, Uh, it is as though, in looking at Shift in this moment, we're not looking at an actor. Rather, we're looking at an actual member of the early modern milieu, one of those people who spends a lot of time hanging out in St. Paul's, trying to see and be seen, trying to get noticed, trying to get some action of various kinds. It's as though we're looking at one of those people who has just wandered into the Globe Theatre by mistake, thinking that it's actually St. Paul's. They are on opposite sides of the river, but they're not very far apart. St. Paul's Theatre and the original Globe Theatre, you could see them across the river, and who knows? Maybe you could take a water taxi the wrong way, wander into the Globe, and be confused for a moment, think that it was actually St. Paul's. That's the impression or the conceit that Jonson is trying to give us for that moment, as though Shift has just wandered into this building. The way people sometimes wander into the wrong condo or something. Wandered into this building thinking that it's St. Paul's, and that's why he's looking around the stage thinking, hey, where's all the people who are usually in St. Paul's? We're like, well, they're not there because this isn't St. Paul's, you idiot. But again, the impression Jonson gives is as though Shift, in that moment, does not understand that. The effect is heightened by the presence of these two very minor characters, Clove and Orange, who appear here and nowhere else in the play. Clove, or rather Orange comes on first, then Clove comes on. He sees Shift, whom he calls Applejohn, which is one of Shift's names. That's his pimp name. He sees Shift. He says, Master Applejohn, you are well met. When shall we sup together and laugh and be fat with those good wenches, ah? Shift says, Faith, sir, I must now leave you upon a few humours and occasions. But when you please, sir, exit. Clove says, Farewell, sweet Applejohn. Clove being the ultra loser of this scenario. He's like, yeah, I know you, Applejohn, bye. Farewell, sweet Applejohn. And then Clove says, I wonder there are no more store of gallants here. So exactly the same little aside that Shift has just had, looking around St. Paul's, saying, hey, where is everybody? Why is it so empty? And the Grex comments on that. Mittis says, what be these two, Signor? Referring to Clove and Orange. What be these two, Signor? Chordata says, Mary, a couple, sir, that are mere strangers to the whole scope of our play, only come to walk or turn or two in this scene of Paul's by chance. Chordata says, well, they kind of wandered in off the street. They're not really part of the play. They just came along to walk around in St. Paul's. Again, as though the stage is not representing Paul's walk, but actually is being mistaken for Paul's walk. Not by us, the audience. We know perfectly well that it's the Globe Theatre, but rather for these members of the early modern milieu who seem to have wandered in off the street and seem to think that they're actually in St. Paul's Cathedral, remarking on how empty it is compared to how it usually is. It's like going to Costco during the coronavirus pandemic, right? Where is everybody? So let's try to wrap this up. It's as though we're observing these guys in their natural habitat, just being themselves, just doing what they do, much in the same way as we are perforce observing the dog. The dog, wherever he is in his natural habitat. All he knows is he's being a dog. He doesn't know he's on stage. He's just in the same whatever place that he's always in, doing the same whatever stuff he always does. And in much the same way, I think, Jonson tries to create an effect, whether or not he is successful, and frankly, whether or not I have made any sense of it for you guys today. I'm not at all sure that I have, but I do want to emphasize that this is the effect that Jonson is trying to produce. He's trying to create an effect in which we are not really watching actors. We're rather watching creatures just doing what they do, much as the dog does. these gulls and gallants of the play just being gulls and gallants, nothing more. And that places a tremendous distance between us, the audience, and them, the figures on the stage. Far greater, I think, than we would normally experience in the theater. And let's wrap up just by trying to tie a ribbon around that point. Normally, we go to the theater, we're watching actors. The actors know they're in a play, and they pretend that they're not, and we, the audience, pretend they don't know they're not, if that makes any sense. They pretend they don't know they're in a play. We pretend they don't know they're in a play. That's how it normally works in the theater. In Every Man Out of His Humor, Jonson labors to create in us, the audience, at least the passing impression or conceit that the actors literally don't know they are in a play, because they are not. They are just, like the dog, a selection or cross-section of the early modern London milieu, just doing what they do, the way they always do it, where they always do it, in the case of Act 3, Scene 1, in the middle aisle of Paul's. It's as though these figures have just wandered into view through the magic window of the play, like Clove and Orange and Shift wandering into the Globe Theatre, onto the stage, seemingly thinking that it's actually the middle aisle of Paul's. I learned years ago that if a beaver, if you play a recording of running water for a beaver, no matter where it is, the beaver will start to build a dam, because it thinks there must be water somewhere if I can hear that trickling sound. That's the kind of effect, I think, that Jonson has tried to produce in the behavior of his gulls and gallants on the stage of Every Man Out. Like the dog, just doing what they do as though in their natural habitat. And we, rather than having any kind of emotional or visceral engagement with them in Jonson's play, rather we are supposed to experience emotional and visceral alienation from them, that radical, very remarkable effect of comic distancing, just as we are distanced from that dog who doesn't know or care that it's in a play, doesn't know or care that we're watching it in a theatrical register. Okay, I want to wrap up there for today. What I hope I've achieved in this lecture is to augment and flesh out that idea of comic distancing in Jonson's Every Man Out. And I want to begin the last lecture, and yes, I'm sorry, there will be one more after this. I want to begin the next and last lecture from that point. What is at stake in that radical comic distancing? What does it allow Jonson to achieve? And what does it allow Jonson to avoid in terms of the emotional and also intellectual work that his play does? In the end, I think we're going to find we have in Every Man Out of His Humor an intensely humanist play in that technical period sense that we have talked about, and in the very conservative Johnsonian sense that we have talked about, predicated on that remarkable effect of comic distancing, which Jonson propagates across these multiple frames of observation in Every Man Out. But I'm going to stop there, and thank you guys very much for watching once again. I hope everybody is doing okay and not going too stir crazy. I will get the last lecture on this play written and recorded and posted in the next day or two. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.